I had been planning this hiking trip for months. I had chosen a trail that was known to be both challenging and isolated, one that promised the quiet solitude I craved, far from any crowds or marked paths. The trailhead was in a remote section of the mountains, accessible only after a long drive along narrow, winding roads that cut through dense forests and steep cliffs. By the time I parked my car, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a faint golden glow across the tips of the pine trees. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and pine sap. I tightened the straps on my backpack, checked my water supply, and set off, eager to begin. The trail started gently, winding through thick woods with moss-covered rocks and tree roots twisting across the path. It was early morning, and the forest was alive with the soft sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The path was uneven, often disappearing under fallen leaves, and I had to focus carefully on where I stepped. Despite my meticulous preparation, I found myself constantly scanning the trail ahead, my eyes adjusting to the shifting patterns of sunlight filtering through the canopy. I felt a mixture of exhilaration and unease. There was a raw beauty to the place, but it was also undeniably isolated. As I moved deeper into the forest, the trail became less defined. The markers were old, faded, and infrequent. At one point, I came to a fork where neither path seemed clearly maintained. I consulted my map and compass, careful to ensure I was still heading in the right direction. I chose the path that appeared to follow the natural incline of the mountain, reasoning that it would lead me higher and give me better vantage points. The ground grew steeper and the underbrush thicker. My legs burned with exertion, and my breath came in short, uneven bursts. Sweat dripped down my back, mixing with the cool morning dew on my shirt. By midday, I had reached a small clearing on the side of the mountain. From here, I could see the valley below, a sprawling expanse of forest punctuated by the glimmer of a distant river. The view was breathtaking, and I stopped to catch my breath, taking out my water bottle and a small snack. The quiet of the mountains pressed in around me, broken only by the distant call of a hawk and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. It was peaceful, but there was a subtle tension beneath it, a sense that I was completely alone, utterly dependent on my own skills and instincts. I made a mental note of the terrain around me, identifying landmarks I could use later if I needed to retrace my steps. After a short break, I continued upward. The trail became progressively more difficult, rocks jutting out at awkward angles, tree roots forming natural obstacles that I had to navigate carefully. At one point, I slipped on a patch of damp moss, barely catching myself on a nearby tree. My heart raced, and I took a moment to steady my nerves, realizing just how precarious the path could be. I adjusted my backpack, making sure it was snug, and moved more cautiously. Each step required full attention. The isolation of the trail became more apparent. I had not seen another hiker all morning, and the thought of encountering anyone, or anything unexpected, was distant yet present in my mind. By mid-afternoon, the terrain changed. The forest thinned, replaced by rocky outcrops and sparse, scrubby vegetation. The trail was harder to follow. Some sections were little more than faint tracks between boulders. I had to use my hands to climb over certain sections, carefully testing each foothold before committing my weight. The sun was high overhead, glaring off the rocks and making the day feel hotter than it had been earlier. I drank steadily, aware of the importance of hydration, and tried to keep my energy up by eating small portions of the food I had brought. It was around this time that I began to feel uneasy in a way that was hard to pinpoint. There was no specific danger, no threatening noise, nothing to see, but an instinctive awareness that I was alone in a vast, untamed environment where a single mistake could have serious consequences. I tried to shake the feeling, attributing it to fatigue and the growing difficulty of the terrain. But even as I climbed, my eyes scanned every rock, every shadow, every distant ridge. The wilderness was beautiful, but it was indifferent, and I realized that if something went wrong, I would be completely on my own. The climb continued for several more hours. I had to navigate narrow ledges with steep drops on either side, testing every foothold and handhold before trusting it. My arms ached from gripping rocks, my legs burned from the constant exertion, and the occasional slip reminded me how vulnerable I was. The wind had picked up, and it cut across the ridge with a sharpness that made my face sting. I wrapped my jacket tightly around myself, grateful for the insulation, and pressed on. As evening approached, I reached a high plateau. It was relatively flat, with scattered boulders and patches of grass, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding peaks. I stopped to rest, scanning the horizon for the sun as it began its slow descent. The view was spectacular, but I was acutely aware that I needed to find a place to camp before darkness fell. I began looking for a suitable spot, one that would be level, sheltered from the wind, and safe from potential hazards like loose rocks or steep drops. I found a small depression behind a cluster of boulders that offered some shelter from the wind. It was far from ideal, but it was workable. I cleared away loose stones and debris, set up my lightweight tent, and organized my supplies. As I worked, the light shifted, casting long shadows across the plateau. The temperature began to drop quickly, and I realized how exposed I was. The sun disappeared behind the peaks, leaving the plateau bathed in a dim twilight that made it difficult to judge distances. I lit a small, controlled camp stove to prepare a simple meal, the smell of cooking food offering some comfort in the growing darkness. Night fell fully, and with it came a profound sense of isolation. The stars emerged, brilliant and countless, but the darkness of the surrounding mountains seemed almost tangible. I had anticipated this, of course, but being alone on such a remote plateau was more intense than I had expected. Every rustle in the wind, every distant crack of rock shifting, set my nerves on edge. I reminded myself that I was prepared, that I had the skills and equipment to handle the night. Still, sleep was difficult to come by. I dozed fitfully, waking frequently to listen for any signs of danger. The next morning, I woke to a cold, clear day. The air was crisp, and frost had formed in patches where the sun had not yet reached. I packed up my camp carefully, making sure nothing was left behind, and began the descent. The morning light revealed the trail more clearly, but it also highlighted just how steep and treacherous certain sections were. I moved cautiously, testing each step, using my trekking poles for balance. As I descended further, I became aware of another problem: fatigue. My muscles were sore, my joints stiff, and my hands raw from gripping rocks and branches. The trail was unforgiving, and I had to concentrate fully to avoid mistakes. At one point, I misjudged a foothold on a loose rock, and my foot slipped. I managed to catch myself on the adjacent boulder, but my heart raced, and I took a few moments to calm down. Each slip reminded me that despite my preparation, the mountains demanded respect and constant vigilance. Around midday, I reached a denser section of forest, where the trail wound through thick underbrush and fallen trees. Visibility was limited, and the shadows created by the canopy made it difficult to judge distance or depth. I moved slowly, carefully, using my poles to probe the ground ahead. The trail was narrow, often forcing me to brush against thorny branches or step over fallen logs. I felt an intense focus, every sense engaged, aware that a single misstep could lead to injury or worse. It was during this section that I realized I had lost track of time. I had been moving for hours without a clear sense of how far I had descended. The isolation, the constant exertion, and the mental strain of navigating difficult terrain had made it easy to lose track of the day. I paused briefly, checking my compass and map, and confirmed that I was still on course. It was reassuring, but also a reminder of just how far from help I truly was. As afternoon turned to evening, the trail began to level out, and the forest opened slightly. I could hear the faint sound of running water in the distance, and I realized that I was approaching the river I had seen from the plateau. The sound was both comforting and energizing, a sign that civilization, or at least easier terrain, was near. I increased my pace slightly, eager to reach safer ground, but still careful to navigate each obstacle. Finally, I reached the riverbank. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. I took a moment to drink from my bottle, refill it with fresh water, and rest my legs. The forest around me was denser here, and I could see signs of a well-trodden path along the river. I had been planning this hike for months, meticulously preparing every detail, from the gear I would take to the exact trail I would follow. It was early October. The air had begun to turn crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and pine needles. I arrived at the trailhead before dawn, the parking lot nearly empty, save for a few cars of early risers. My backpack was heavy, loaded with water, food, first aid supplies, and extra layers of clothing, as I was expecting the temperature to drop as the sun fell behind the mountains. I wanted this hike to be a test of endurance, a way to push myself in solitude while enjoying the quiet grandeur of the wilderness. The trail started off gently, winding through a dense forest of oak and maple trees. The ground was soft, covered with a thick layer of fallen leaves that muffled my steps. I felt a comforting sense of isolation as I walked. The sun began to rise, casting a golden light through the trees, illuminating patches of fog that lingered from the morning dew. Birds called from high branches, and a small creek ran alongside the trail, its gentle trickle the only sound besides my breathing. I followed the trail closely, enjoying the rhythm of walking and breathing, keeping my pace steady to conserve energy. As I ascended, the trail grew steeper, and the forest began to thin. The trees were taller here, spaced further apart, and the undergrowth was sparse. I noticed more animal tracks: deer, raccoon, and possibly coyote. I paused occasionally to observe, feeling a sense of connectedness to the land. My water supply was adequate, and the day was progressing smoothly. By late morning, I had reached a ridge that overlooked a deep valley, the view breathtaking. The mountains stretched for miles, their peaks dusted with early snow. I stopped to eat a snack, resting on a flat rock and taking in the scenery, savoring the quiet beauty. After about an hour, I continued on a narrower section of the trail, the incline more demanding. The soil was loose, and rocks jutted out at odd angles, requiring careful footing. I was alone, and the silence was both calming and eerie. As I rounded a bend, I noticed the trail descending sharply toward a ravine. The air was cooler here, and the forest grew darker with the dense canopy above. I was focused on my footing, but I sensed something unusual, an uneasy stillness that made the hair on my neck stand on end. I told myself it was just my imagination. I continued, careful with each step, until I reached a small clearing. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere just beyond the trees. I froze, listening intently. My heart rate quickened, and I scanned the clearing and nearby forest. At first, I saw nothing, only the shifting shadows of the branches in the wind. Then, a large figure emerged from behind a cluster of trees. A bear, enormous, its fur a mix of brown and black, eyes focused directly on me. My stomach dropped. I had seen bears before, but never this close, and never in this much solitude. I instinctively remembered the advice I had read countless times. Do not run, stay calm, make yourself appear large. I slowly raised my arms, keeping my gaze on the bear while stepping back cautiously. It mirrored my movement, advancing slightly, sniffing the air. The clearing was uneven, with rocks and fallen logs that could be used as obstacles if needed. I reached for my bear spray, my fingers trembling, aware that the bear's movements were deliberate, almost curious but menacing. Minutes felt like hours. The bear growled again, more forcefully this time, its eyes never leaving mine. I inched backward toward a fallen tree that lay diagonally across the clearing, a potential barrier. The bear hesitated, then stepped closer, its massive paws crunching on the leaf-covered ground. I sprayed a short burst of bear spray toward its face. The bear recoiled slightly, sneezing and shaking its head, but it did not retreat entirely. I continued to back away slowly, keeping the bear in my line of sight. The terrain was steep, and the further I moved, the more dangerous it became. Rocks loosened underfoot, and I had to carefully test each step. My mind raced, evaluating escape options, remembering that climbing a tree could be dangerous, as the bear might follow, but I also noticed a ridge above the clearing that might provide safer footing. I began a careful, zigzagging ascent toward that ridge, my legs trembling but focused. The bear followed intermittently, pausing to assess, but never losing interest. My breathing was controlled, slow, though my body was tense with fear. I kept moving, my boots slipping on loose soil and leaves, forcing me to dig in with my hands at times to maintain balance. Adrenaline surged, heightening my senses. I could hear the bear's labored breathing, the snapping of small branches under its weight. I knew that one misstep could be fatal. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the ridge. It was narrow and rocky with steep drops on either side, but it gave me higher ground. I paused to catch my breath, knowing I had to maintain a position that was defensible. The bear emerged from the trees below, looking up at me with a mix of curiosity and frustration. I realized I had gained an advantage: height, visibility, and slightly more space. I carefully edged along the ridge, moving toward a denser cluster of pine trees that might offer better protection. As I reached the pines, I noticed a large rock formation forming a natural barrier. I crouched behind it, assessing the bear's behavior. It was circling below, sniffing the air, occasionally letting out low growls. I remained perfectly still, knowing that sudden movement could provoke it. I slowly unbuckled my backpack and secured the bear spray in an accessible pocket. I also took out a sturdy hiking stick, ready to use it to create noise or defend if necessary. The bear sniffed the air again, then retreated slightly into the forest, perhaps deciding I was not worth the energy or sensing that my higher position made me difficult to approach. I did not move immediately, knowing that the danger was not over. I waited, scanning the surrounding forest for any signs of the bear returning or other wildlife. Time passed slowly, the tension almost unbearable. After what seemed like another hour, the bear finally retreated deeper into the forest. I waited even longer, cautiously assessing the area before considering my next move. My body was exhausted, but my mind remained alert. I decided to carefully descend from the ridge toward a safer trail I had noted earlier. The descent was slow and deliberate. Loose rocks and steep slopes made every step critical. I used the hiking stick to test the ground ahead and to steady myself. My legs were sore, my hands scraped from gripping rocks, but the fear of encountering the bear again kept me focused. After a painstaking descent, I reached a flatter section of the trail. I could hear the distant sound of the creek below and birds beginning to call again. The forest seemed to return to its usual rhythm, the tension of the encounter slowly ebbing. I maintained a cautious pace, eyes scanning the trees for any movement, but the immediate threat had passed. Eventually, I reached a small trail junction marked on my map. Here, I could see a more traveled path that would lead back toward the trailhead. I allowed myself a moment to breathe freely, feeling the tension drain from my body. Every muscle ached, my heart still racing, but I felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment. I had survived a situation that could have ended disastrously. I continued along the safer trail, moving carefully but more confidently. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows and bathing the forest in a warm, amber light. I stayed on the trail, avoiding shortcuts or risky terrain. After several hours, I could hear the faint sound of cars and distant voices near the trailhead. The normalcy of human activity was almost startling after the intensity of the encounter. Finally, I emerged from the forest, the parking lot in view. My legs were sore, my backpack heavy, and my body fatigued, but I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I knew I had tested my limits, relied on my preparation, and stayed calm under extreme pressure. The encounter with the bear had been terrifying, but it had also reminded me of the raw power and unpredictability of nature. As I packed my gear into the car, I reflected on every detail of the hike: the sound of leaves underfoot, the scent of the forest, the intense moments of fear, and the cautious strategies that allowed me to survive. I knew I would never forget the experience. It was a vivid reminder of the importance of preparation, awareness, and respect for wildlife. I drove away from the trailhead slowly, taking deep breaths, feeling a mix of exhaustion and triumph. That day, I had faced a real, primal danger and emerged intact, wiser and more appreciative of the fragile balance between humans and the wild. I had been planning this hike for months. It wasn't a casual walk in the woods or a short day hike. It was a serious backcountry trek through a remote section of the mountains that few people ever ventured into. I had studied the trail maps, read accounts from other hikers, and even checked the weather reports for weeks in advance. I wanted this to be an experience I could fully absorb, a chance to get away from the city, from noise, from everything, and just be in the rawness of nature. I had a feeling it would test me in ways I couldn't imagine, and I wanted that. I wasn't expecting what actually happened. I started early in the morning, before the sun had fully climbed above the horizon. The air was cold, crisp, and carried a quiet stillness that made every breath feel sharper, almost tangible. My pack was heavy, filled with water, food, first aid, a tent, a sleeping bag, and all the other essentials I thought I might need for a 2-day trek. I had my hiking boots tightly laced, my jacket zipped up, and my hat pulled low to block the rising sun from my eyes. The trailhead was nearly deserted, except for a few birds that hopped nervously from branch to branch, and the soft rustle of leaves in the morning breeze. The first several hours were uneventful. The path was steep in places, with loose rocks and tree roots jutting out at awkward angles. I had to pay attention constantly, making sure I didn't trip or twist an ankle. I moved steadily, pausing only to catch my breath, drink water, or take photographs of the scenery that kept unfolding in layers. Deep green forests, occasional clearings, and distant peaks dusted with snow. There was a river somewhere below the trail, its sound faint but constant, and every so often, I could smell the wet earth and pine in the air. By late morning, I had entered a section of the trail that was far more isolated. The trees grew closer together, their trunks thick and gnarled, branches weaving into a sort of tunnel overhead that dimmed the sunlight. The air felt heavier here, damp, almost suffocating at times. The ground was covered in a thick layer of leaves, wet in some areas, dry in others, which made every step uneven and noisy. It was in this section that I first noticed the silence had changed. Not that it was completely quiet. There were still birds, the distant water, but it was a quiet that felt wrong. Too complete, too expectant. I paused and looked around. I noticed the trail was less defined here. My boots sank slightly into the soft soil with each step, and I realized the path was fading. It wasn't overgrown exactly, but it was less obvious, less traveled. I checked my map and GPS, confirming I was still on track, but I knew I had to pay closer attention. Mistakes in this area could be costly. As the morning moved into early afternoon, I reached a small plateau that gave a panoramic view of the valley below. I stopped here for lunch. I set down my pack, took out a sandwich, and ate slowly, savoring the moment, the quiet, the sun warming my shoulders. The view was incredible, but I felt a tiny shiver creep over me. There was something unnerving about how isolated this area felt, about the steep drop-offs and the lack of any visible path beyond this point. I shrugged off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. I had done backcountry hiking before. I knew what isolation felt like. After eating, I repacked, refilled my water, and began the descent down the slope that would take me further into the backcountry. The trail became even less distinct. Rocks and roots jutted out at odd angles. The incline grew sharper, and every step required careful planning. I was moving slower now, my energy spent navigating the difficult terrain, and I noticed that the sun had begun its descent. Shadows were growing long, stretching across the forest floor like dark fingers. That's when I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, branches rattling, leaves rustling, but then it became clear it wasn't. It was the sound of rocks shifting, faint and deliberate, somewhere off the trail, deeper in the forest. I froze, listening. The sound didn't move like an animal. It was heavier, uneven, like something or someone was moving cautiously, deliberately. My stomach tightened. I told myself it was probably another hiker, though I hadn't seen anyone since the trailhead. I adjusted my pack, moved a few steps forward, and kept going, trying not to make any sudden noises. The forest grew darker as I descended. Sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above. Every crackling branch underfoot sounded louder than it should. The noises from off the trail became more pronounced, more rhythmic. There was a snap of a twig to my left, a scrape of rock to my right. My heart rate quickened. I tried to maintain a steady pace, telling myself I wasn't imagining it. But deep down, I knew something was off. I had that unmistakable feeling hikers talk about. The hair on the back of your neck rising, your gut tightening, your brain shouting caution while your body hesitates. I decided to keep moving quickly, trying to get through this section before it got too dark. The trail narrowed into a barely recognizable path, littered with fallen branches and loose stones. My boots slipped several times, once sending me nearly tumbling down a short slope. My hands scraped against the rocks, and I felt cuts open across my palms. I cursed under my breath. That's when I noticed it. Faint footprints in the dirt, not mine, fresh, leading in the same direction as the trail. I stopped, kneeling to examine them. They were irregular, too large to be an animal, not the pattern of a human jogging boot exactly, more like someone wearing thick-soled hiking shoes but heavier. They weren't old. The edges hadn't crumbled or washed away with rain. I could see where each foot pressed into the dirt, toes splayed slightly. My heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever had left these prints was close. I debated turning back, but I realized the path behind me was already becoming confusing, overgrown, and steep. Retracing my steps in fading light would be risky, too. I had no choice but to move forward. I stuffed my fear down, focused on the path, and kept going. Every step felt calculated, cautious. I tried to make as little noise as possible, but the ground resisted, crunching underfoot. The noises from the forest grew louder, closer, almost as if they were following me. I could hear snapping branches, soft shuffles, the faint scraping of something heavy. I kept moving, eyes scanning the trees, listening for anything obvious. Shadows danced unnaturally in the dim light. I had no flashlight. I had forgotten to pack extra batteries, relying on my headlamp, which I was conserving for when the sun fully set. The trail twisted unpredictably, and I realized I had no landmarks I could recognize. By now, the sun had completely set. Darkness enveloped the forest. I turned on my headlamp, the beam cutting a cone through the black, revealing tangled roots and moss-covered rocks. The noises were constant now, closer, heavier. I could feel my heart thudding so loudly I worried it might give me away. My breathing was shallow, controlled, and I forced myself to keep moving. The trail finally opened onto a small clearing, a depression in the forest floor. I stopped here, crouched, and tried to catch my breath. My legs were screaming, my hands scraped and bloody, my back aching from the weight of the pack. The clearing felt too open, too exposed, but I needed to rest. That's when I noticed something else. Movement at the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the trees. A figure, or the outline of one, moved slowly, cautiously, disappearing behind the trunks. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. Panic threatened to overwhelm me. I realized I had a choice. Keep moving blindly through the forest in the dark, or find a place to hunker down and assess my situation. I chose the latter. I scanned the clearing and found a small rock overhang, a shallow depression in the earth with a few trees leaning around it that offered some cover. I crawled under it, pressing myself against the cold rock, trying to make myself small, quiet. I could hear the rustling again, closer now, moving around the clearing's edge. Hours passed. I stayed hidden, completely still, counting every breath, every sound. I had no idea what was out there. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was a hunter, a hiker who had gotten lost like me, someone heavyset and cautious. Or maybe it was something else. The uncertainty gnawed at me more than the fatigue or pain. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that dawn would come, that I could navigate then. When the first faint light of morning touched the forest, I waited another long half-hour before moving. My legs were stiff, my back sore, my hands still scraped, but I was alive. I slowly, carefully emerged from the rock overhang, scanning the trees. The clearing was empty. There were no tracks except my own and those from the day before, but I could see some signs that something had been there. Broken branches, scuffed dirt. I moved cautiously down the trail, keeping the first light of day at my back, alert. I had been planning this hike for months, poring over maps, reading trail reports, and carefully selecting gear that would keep me prepared for anything. I wanted isolation, the kind of quiet that cities had swallowed long ago, and the kind of danger that felt tangible rather than imagined. The trail I chose wound through steep ridges and deep valleys, the kind of wilderness that had few hikers and even fewer signs of human presence. I packed lightly but efficiently. A sturdy backpack, plenty of water, high-calorie food, a first aid kit, a multi-tool, a compass, headlamp, and spare batteries. I had boots that were broken in, socks that would keep my feet dry, and clothing that layered easily for changing conditions. I left early in the morning, when the sun was just climbing the horizon and the air was crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but it had a weight to it, a sense that I was stepping into a place that did not care about me or my schedule. The first few hours were easy. The trail followed a narrow dirt path that twisted around moss-covered rocks and under towering pines. Sunlight filtered through the branches, forming sharp beams that danced across the trail with every sway of the trees. I kept a steady pace, mindful of the uneven terrain and loose soil underfoot. My water bottle emptied faster than expected, but I had planned for that and refilled it from small streams along the way. Each stream required some care. I used a portable filter to remove sediment and bacteria, but I drank cautiously, aware that even the clearest water could hide something that would ruin days of preparation. By late morning, the trail began to climb more sharply. The forest thinned, and I entered a zone of jagged rocks and exposed roots. Every step required careful attention. One wrong placement could send me sliding down a slope or spraining an ankle. I stopped occasionally to catch my breath, lean against a rock, and look out at the view. The valley below stretched wide and green, a quilt of trees and rivers that shimmered in the sunlight. I felt small and fragile in comparison, an awareness that gave me both awe and unease. There was a quiet that was almost unnatural here, a pause in the usual rustling and calls of birds. Even the wind felt hesitant, as if holding back. I had been hiking for 6 hours when I noticed a sign that something was off. The trail markers had become sparse, and the path itself was fading, overgrown with brambles and moss. My map suggested I was still on track, but the trail I walked seemed to narrow and bend in ways that didn't match the map exactly. I stopped, consulting the compass and the printed map, tracing the line of my intended route. Everything suggested I was correct, yet my gut told me otherwise. A creeping sense of isolation began to settle in my chest, an anxiety that had nothing to do with physical exertion. I pushed it aside, telling myself that overconfidence was my real danger. As the sun began its descent, the forest grew denser and darker. Shadows lengthened and the air became cooler, damp with the scent of decaying leaves. I could hear the distant murmur of a stream below, and I decided to descend toward it, reasoning that following water downhill would lead me to a more recognizable area. The descent was steep and treacherous. Loose rocks skittered underfoot, forcing me to slow and maintain 3 points of contact whenever possible. My thighs burned, my palms ached from gripping rocks, and I could feel the onset of fatigue, the kind that dulls judgment if ignored. I reached the stream just as the light began to fade completely. Darkness settled quickly among the trees, leaving only the faint glow of the last sunlit peaks. I knew that hiking in darkness without proper lighting was dangerous, but I had a headlamp in my pack. I paused to set up a temporary camp beside the stream, clearing a small area for my sleeping bag and laying out my gear. I drank and ate cautiously, feeling both relieved and apprehensive. Relief for having found water and a flat spot to rest, apprehension for being far from any trail and uncertain of what the next day would bring. I slept fitfully, the sound of the stream lulling me but also masking every snap of a twig or rustle in the brush. When I woke, the sky was overcast. Clouds had moved in overnight, making the forest dim even in daylight. I planned to continue along the stream to find a connecting trail, but I quickly realized that my assumption about the water leading to safety might have been flawed. The stream split into multiple small rivulets, weaving around fallen logs and boulders, making it impossible to follow directly. I chose one branch and began to follow it, climbing over rocks and wading through shallow pools. The forest grew thicker, the trees close enough to brush my shoulders. My boots became soaked, and the constant effort to balance on slippery rocks left my muscles screaming in protest. Hours passed with little progress. Every time I thought I recognized a formation from my map, the terrain betrayed me. I had underestimated how quickly wilderness can turn familiar landmarks into confusing duplicates. By mid-afternoon, I was exhausted, my pace slowed, and my energy stores dwindling. I stopped to rest, leaning against a wet boulder, drinking the last of my filtered water. I realized the gravity of my situation. I was disoriented, alone, and very far from any recognizable trail. The sense of isolation that had been creeping in the previous day now pressed in with full force. The sky darkened further as late afternoon approached. I had no choice but to continue, but every step became more dangerous. The ground was uneven, slick with moss and rain from the previous night, and steep drops lurked behind every bend. I kept my eyes constantly scanning the terrain, watching for loose rocks, unstable soil, and low-hanging branches. My feet ached, my legs trembled, and I began to notice small mistakes. A misstep here, a slip there, that were small in isolation but cumulative in their effect. Then it happened. A sudden misstep sent me sliding down a muddy slope, my backpack dragging me backward. I managed to grab a tree root just in time, but my left ankle twisted sharply beneath me. Pain shot through it, searing and immediate. I groaned and pulled myself up, testing the ankle cautiously. It was swollen, throbbing, and clearly sprained. Panic fluttered in my chest, but I forced it down. I had survived worse physical challenges, and fear wouldn't help me navigate this one. I fashioned a rough splint from a branch and some cloth from my backpack, trying to stabilize the joint as best as I could. Night was approaching rapidly. I had no choice but to find shelter nearby. I climbed a short incline and found a small, rocky overhang that would keep me off the wet ground. It was not ideal, but it was better than nothing. I set up my sleeping bag as best as I could, wrapped my ankle tightly, and ate a small meal to maintain my energy. The stream continued to babble nearby, a small comfort and a reminder that I had water. I lay down, muscles sore and mind racing. Every noise in the forest, branches snapping, leaves rustling, the distant cry of a bird, made my pulse quicken. I tried to focus on maintaining calm, reminding myself that I was trained for emergencies, that panic would only make mistakes more likely. Morning came slowly. The sky was gray and rain had begun to fall lightly, soaking the forest and making the terrain even more treacherous. My ankle was stiff and painful, but I knew I couldn't stay in that spot indefinitely. I decided to move slowly toward lower ground, hoping to find a road or a trail. Each step required deliberate attention. I used a sturdy branch as a cane, distributing weight away from my injured ankle. Rocks that were already slippery from rain became almost impossible to navigate, and I had to slide and crawl in some areas to maintain stability. Hunger and fatigue gnawed at me, but I forced myself to keep moving, knowing that stopping would only increase the risk of injury or exposure. Hours passed. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees, rocks, and undergrowth. My supplies were running low, and the rain was relentless. I focused on small goals: move to the next tree, climb over the next rock, cross the next fallen log. Step by step, I advanced, every movement deliberate and careful. My fingers were raw from gripping rocks and branches, my boots soaked, my clothes clinging to me in cold dampness. Finally, I heard something unusual, a faint sound of metal on metal, a rhythmic thumping that was different from the natural sounds of the forest. My heart leapt. I followed the sound cautiously, descending a small ridge, and saw a clearing ahead. There was a gravel service road cutting through the forest, wet but passable. Relief surged through me. I limped forward, careful with each step, until I reached the road itself. The sense of isolation that had weighed me down for 2 days lifted almost immediately. I walked along the road for an hour until I spotted a small ranger station in the distance. Someone was there, a real human presence. Exhausted and soaked, I approached and explained my situation with gestures and signs, since talking was difficult. I had planned the hike for months, obsessively mapping every trail, checking weather patterns, and making a list of supplies I would need. I like to think of myself as careful, someone who plans for every eventuality. I never expected a simple day hike to turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. The trail I chose was a little-known route through a remote section of the mountains, far from the usual tourist paths. It promised solitude, clear streams, dense forests, and rocky outcroppings with panoramic views. It also promised danger, though I didn't realize just how much. I started early in the morning, before the sun had fully risen. The air was cold and sharp, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. My backpack was heavy, loaded with water, snacks, a first aid kit, and an extra layer of clothing. I wore sturdy boots and a rain jacket, though the forecast had said clear skies. The first hour was peaceful. I walked along a narrow dirt path, winding through towering trees. The sunlight filtered in thin beams through the canopy, casting a golden glow on moss-covered rocks. Birds called occasionally, though their voices seemed distant, almost swallowed by the forest around me. I reached the first clearing about 2 hours into the hike. It overlooked a small valley below, a river snaking through it like a silver ribbon. I sat on a rock, taking off my pack to drink some water. The wind was light but cold, brushing against my cheeks. I tried to take mental notes of my surroundings, marking landmarks in my mind. There were rocks with unusual shapes, clusters of evergreens, a narrow dirt path winding down into the valley. I told myself to remember everything, just in case. After a brief rest, I started up the trail again. The path grew steeper, and the ground was uneven, covered in loose stones. Every step had to be deliberate. I felt a small thrill of satisfaction. I love the physical challenge of hiking steep trails. But as I moved higher, the air grew thinner, colder, and more biting. The trees thinned, replaced by shrubs and exposed rock. I paused to catch my breath, feeling a twinge of anxiety. Nothing seemed wrong. There were no signs of danger, but the silence was heavy. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. I continued, forcing myself to focus on the trail beneath my boots. About 3 hours into the hike, I noticed something unusual. There were broken branches and flattened grass along a narrow side path. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe deer or elk moving through, but the marks were too large, too deep. Then I saw the footprints. They were human and they were fresh. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The prints led off the trail and into the denser forest. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone had been here very recently. I debated whether to turn back. Part of me wanted to retreat, to abandon the hike and head home, but another part of me, the part that thrives on challenge, wanted to see where the trail led. I decided to proceed, but with caution. I kept my eyes and ears alert, scanning the forest for movement. The trail wound around jagged rocks and steep inclines, making my progress slow. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that it was just a coincidence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. By late morning, the trail became almost impassable. Rocks and fallen trees blocked the path, forcing me to climb carefully. I had to use my hands to steady myself, pressing against rough stone and tree roots. Every small sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me tense. I kept thinking I saw movement in the corners of my eyes, but when I turned, there was nothing. I was alone, or so I told myself, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Around midday, I reached a small ridge overlooking a sheer drop. The view was breathtaking. The valley below stretched endlessly, a patchwork of green and brown, with the river glinting in the sunlight. I stopped to catch my breath and take in the scenery. I felt a moment of relief. The fear I had carried since the footprints seemed to dissipate. I even laughed quietly at myself for being paranoid. I had survived worse trails, had faced storms and slippery climbs, yet here I was, afraid of nothing tangible. I decided to continue along the ridge, following a narrow path that hugged the cliffside. The trail was precarious. One wrong step could mean a fatal fall. I moved slowly, deliberately, testing each foothold. About 20 minutes in, I slipped. My boots skidded on loose gravel, and I scrambled to regain balance. My heart was racing, and for a moment, I felt an icy panic. If I fell, I could slide hundreds of feet before hitting anything solid. I forced myself to calm down, breathing deeply and adjusting my grip on the rock face. After a few tense minutes, I stabilized and continued. That's when I heard it. A low, deliberate rustling behind me. I froze. My instincts screamed that it was human. I didn't dare turn. I waited, holding my breath, listening. The sound stopped. For a moment, I thought it had been my imagination. But then I heard it again, closer this time, accompanied by a faint snapping of twigs. I realized I had made a mistake by taking this ridge path. It was too exposed, too narrow, and I was vulnerable. My hands shook as I reached for my backpack, where I had a whistle and a small knife. I didn't want to think about using it, but I had to be ready. I backed up slowly, trying to retrace my steps without losing balance. The person, or whatever it was, seemed to be following. The noise of snapping branches echoed against the cliffs, making it impossible to know exactly where they were. My mind raced, thinking of all the ways I could escape, all the worst-case scenarios. I tried to calm myself, telling myself to think logically, but fear gripped me tightly. Every step felt like it could be my last. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I spotted a small, narrow path that led down the mountainside into a cluster of trees. It was risky, but it might offer cover. I carefully edged my way down, pressing close to the rock face. My boots slipped several times, scraping against jagged stones, but I managed to stay upright. By the time I reached the tree cover, my hands and legs were trembling, and my heart felt like it would burst from my chest. I crouched behind a large pine, trying to calm my breathing. I waited, straining my ears, but the sounds of pursuit had faded. I didn't dare move yet. My legs were unsteady, my body soaked in sweat despite the cold. I realized that I had no idea where I was. The trail had vanished somewhere along the ridge, swallowed by rocks and trees. I was lost, and the thought made my stomach twist. I took a sip of water, forcing myself to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help. I needed a plan. I decided to follow the river I had seen from the ridge. Water often leads to civilization, or at least a recognizable landmark. I moved slowly, carefully, stepping over roots and rocks, keeping the river in sight whenever I could. Hours passed. My legs burned. My backpack felt impossibly heavy, and the fear of encountering whoever had been following me lingered like a shadow. Occasionally, I heard sounds that made my stomach jump, a distant crack of a branch, the splash of water, but every time I checked, there was nothing. As the afternoon wore on, clouds began to gather. The wind picked up, carrying a cold bite that made me shiver. I knew that if I got caught in a storm, I would be in serious trouble. I pushed myself harder, moving as quickly as I dared over the uneven terrain. The forest grew denser, the underbrush thick and tangled. At one point, I nearly fell into a small ravine hidden by ferns and vines. My heart pounded as I scrambled to safety, realizing just how thin the line between life and injury could be here. Finally, as evening approached, I saw a clearing ahead. My heart leapt. It wasn't a settlement, but I could see tire tracks in the dirt and a faint path leading away from the river. Someone had been here recently, and it gave me hope. I followed the tracks carefully, praying they would lead to a road or another hiker. The forest began to thin, and soon I heard the faint hum of a distant highway. Relief washed over me in a way I had never experienced before. I was tired, shaken, and raw with fear, but I had survived. I emerged onto a dirt road just as the sun dipped below the horizon. A car passed by slowly, and I waved my arms, trying not to collapse from exhaustion. The driver stopped, and I gratefully accepted a ride to the nearest town. I called the local ranger station to report my route and the footprints I had found, explaining everything as calmly as I could. They promised to investigate. That night, in a warm bed, I replayed the day over and over. I thought about the ridge, the sounds behind me, the fear that had gripped me. I remember the morning I decided to go on that hike like it was yesterday, even though it's been years. I had planned it for weeks, reading trail guides, looking at maps, checking the weather every day, and finally, the morning arrived. The sky was pale, with a thin layer of clouds, the kind that promised a cool day but no rain. I packed my bag carefully: water, extra clothes, snacks, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a small pocket knife, and a map. I had my phone fully charged, though I knew the reception would be spotty once I went deeper into the trail. I wanted to challenge myself, to be alone in the wilderness for a day, to push my limits. The trail started easily, a dirt path winding through dense pine trees. The air smelled clean, almost sweet, with the faint scent of pine sap and damp earth. The forest was quiet, apart from the occasional rustle of birds or the distant tapping of a woodpecker. At first, I walked briskly, enjoying the morning air, my legs warm from the steady pace. I passed a few other hikers, all friendly nods, but soon I was alone, which was exactly what I wanted. The trail grew narrower, steeper, and less maintained. Roots twisted across the path, rocks protruded at odd angles, and small streams cut through the trail in some places. Hours passed. My legs ached, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind that made me feel alive. I stopped occasionally to drink water or eat a small snack. The sun rose higher, filtering through the trees in long streaks, lighting up patches of the trail like spotlights. I felt completely isolated but completely safe. Until I didn't. I had reached a part of the trail that climbed sharply up a ridge. The trees were sparser here, and the forest floor was covered with loose rocks and gravel. I was focused on my footing, my hands brushing against tree trunks for balance, when I noticed something strange. A small animal ran across the trail ahead of me. A fox, I thought at first, but it moved awkwardly. Its gait was uneven, almost desperate. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't a fox. It was a dog, a medium-sized mutt, dirty, thin, and clearly lost. Its eyes were wide and wild. It didn't run away when it saw me. Instead, it stared, unblinking, like it was sizing me up. I froze. The dog barked once, low and hoarse, and then ran down a side path. I considered following it. It looked injured, maybe it needed help. But a small voice in my head told me to stay on the main trail. I shook it off, thinking it was just a wild animal, and continued upward. That's when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. The trail was supposed to loop back down after the ridge, but I reached the top, and the path seemed wrong. The markers I had memorized, the little orange ribbons tied to branches to guide hikers, were gone. I paused, looking around. The ridge was narrow, steep drops on either side, and the wind had picked up. The trees were sparse, the rocks jagged. I checked my map, tracing the trail. Everything should have curved left, but the path ahead seemed to continue straight along the ridge. I hesitated. My gut told me to turn back, but I had come so far, and the ridge was beautiful. The valley stretched out below me, rivers sparkling like silver threads in the sunlight. I took a deep breath and started forward. The next hour was terrifying in ways I hadn't expected. The path narrowed further, and loose rocks crumbled under my boots. I had to move carefully, testing each step before committing my weight. The ridge dropped steeply on both sides, and one misstep could mean disaster. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, my breath ragged, and every sound, wind, birds, distant water, felt magnified. Then I saw it, footprints, large, deep, and irregular, cutting across the narrow path. I stopped immediately. They weren't human footprints, too large, too spaced out. I crouched to examine them, noting the claws and the uneven pressure. My stomach dropped. Whatever had made these tracks was big, strong, and moving fast. My mind flashed to warnings I had read about wildlife attacks. Mountain lions, bears, but I tried to stay calm. I told myself to stay rational. Minutes later, I heard a low growl behind me. My blood froze. I turned slowly, scanning the ridge. Nothing. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the rocks. My legs tensed, my hands sweaty, and I took a small step backward. The growl stopped. I froze. Then, from somewhere above me on the slope, a rustling noise, like heavy branches being broken, echoed down. Panic hit me like a wave. I knew I had two options: climb back down the ridge as fast as possible or move forward and hope to reach a safer spot. My legs moved almost automatically, heading along the ridge, eyes fixed on the path ahead. Every step was a gamble. Loose stones slid underfoot. My heart raced so hard I thought it might burst, and every sound, wind through the sparse pines, rocks falling down the slope, made me jump. I kept moving and the sounds followed. Rustling, snapping branches, the low growl returning intermittently. I didn't look back. Couldn't. Fear had taken over every rational thought. I just focused on placing one foot in front of the other, moving as fast and safely as I could. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes and days at the same time. My water was running low, my legs screamed, and the ridge seemed endless. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal, of course. I tried to remember everything from survival guides. Make yourself appear big, stay calm, make noise, but I was too scared to even breathe properly. Then suddenly the ridge widened. Rocks gave way to a flat area, covered with sparse grass and a few hardy shrubs. The sounds had stopped. I stopped too, knees trembling, leaning on my trekking poles, trying to catch my breath. I looked around. The ridge sloped downward gently ahead of me, and I could see trees thicker than before. I realized I might be able to reach a safer part of the forest, maybe even a trail junction. Relief mixed with exhaustion, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I started down the slope carefully, each step deliberate. The forest thickened as I descended, branches brushing against my arms and legs. The sun had begun to lower in the sky, and the shadows stretched long, but I could see enough to navigate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I spotted something familiar. A trail marker, a little orange ribbon tied to a branch. My heart leapt. I followed it, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. The path gradually widened and leveled out, and after another hour, I emerged onto the main trail. I collapsed on a flat rock, utterly drained. My hands shook, my legs refused to support me properly, and my throat was dry. I checked my bag. Almost all my water was gone. I had eaten the last of my snacks hours ago. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, feeling the first real sense of safety since the ridge. I started walking along the main trail slowly, carefully, but without panic. Every step was a victory. Birds chirped normally, a stream gurgled nearby, and I could see other hikers in the distance. The ordinary sounds of the forest felt surreal, almost comforting after the tension of the ridge. Eventually, the trail looped back toward the parking area. I emerged from the forest into a clearing just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. My legs were stiff, my body sore, but I had made it. I could see cars, other hikers packing up, the parking lot lights flickering on. I walked slowly to my car, shaking, drenched in sweat and dirt, my bag heavy but somehow comforting. I sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the steering wheel, and just breathed. I drove home that evening, exhausted but alive. I never saw the dog again, nor did I see anything else unusual. Looking back, I realized how close I had come to disaster, how easily a single misstep could have ended everything. But I had survived. I had trusted my instincts, stayed focused, and kept moving even when fear threatened to paralyze me. That night, I slept deeply, finally able to let go of the tension in my body. I thought about the ridge, the prints, the growl, and even though it had been terrifying, it had also taught me something. Preparation, caution, and focus are everything when you are in the wild, And sometimes survival is about keeping calm and moving forward, even when the world around you feels unsafe. I returned to hiking later, but I never took the ridge trail again. I stuck to marked paths, always respecting the wild and its unpredictability. And every time I pass a trail marker, I think back to that day, grateful to be alive, grateful for the small victories, and careful never to take the wilderness for granted. I had always loved hiking. The smell of pine in the early morning, the crisp air that felt sharp in your lungs, the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. It all made me feel alive in a way nothing else could. I had spent years exploring the trails around my town, but there was one trail I had always avoided. It was a long, remote trail in the mountains several hours from the nearest town. People in forums talked about it like it was cursed with misfortune. Hikers would start it and disappear, or be found days later exhausted and scared, often with minor injuries that didn't make sense. I always dismissed it. Nature was unpredictable, people were careless, but there was nothing supernatural there. That was my thinking anyway. I set out early, before the sun had even broken over the horizon. The drive to the trailhead was long, twisting through narrow roads, past old barns and patches of forest where the trees crowded so close you couldn't see the sky. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and pine. When I finally parked, the gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out. My backpack felt heavier than usual. I had packed extra supplies: water, food, first aid, a map, a compass, and a flashlight. I had told myself to be prepared. The trail started easily. A gentle incline, a path cleared through the trees. Birds were singing, and the air was fresh. I walked for hours, enjoying the way the sunlight streamed through the branches, turning everything gold. Every now and then I crossed small streams. I knelt to sip water from one of them, tasting the cold, clean stream water, feeling energized. I thought about how beautiful the trail was, how untouched it seemed. The sense of isolation was thrilling, not frightening. But as the day wore on, the trail began to change. The incline became steeper, the roots and rocks more numerous. My legs started to ache, and I noticed the sun was lower than I had thought. I checked my watch. I had been walking for 6 hours. My stomach grumbled. I took out some granola bars and water and sat on a large rock to eat. The forest around me was quiet now. Birds had stopped singing, and even the rustle of small animals seemed to have gone silent. I felt a slight unease, but told myself it was just fatigue. I kept moving. The trail narrowed, becoming little more than a path cut through dense undergrowth. Every step became deliberate. I had to avoid tripping over roots or slipping on wet rocks. I noticed how isolated it had become. No signs of other hikers, no sounds except the occasional snapping of a branch underfoot. My mind started imagining all sorts of scenarios. Falling, twisting an ankle, getting lost, but I pushed the thoughts aside. I had been on tougher trails before. Then, I noticed the trail markers were becoming sparse. I had been following painted marks on the trees, red and white, that indicated the path. But now, for nearly half an hour, I hadn't seen one. I stopped and pulled out my map. I tried to match the contours of the trail to my surroundings, but the dense forest made it difficult. I knew the trail would eventually lead to a ridge with a clearing, but I couldn't see it. The sun was dropping behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the forest floor. My unease was growing. I decided to keep moving. I thought that maybe I had missed a marker, or that the trail had shifted slightly due to fallen trees. My pace slowed. Every step became more cautious. I stumbled over a root and landed hard on my knee. Pain shot up my leg, but it was nothing serious. I dusted myself off, took a deep breath, and kept going. The trail became almost non-existent, just a faint path through undergrowth. I realized I had no real sense of direction. The forest all looked the same: dense trees, thick brush, moss-covered rocks. By the time the sun fully disappeared, I was in trouble. I could no longer see the trail at all. The last traces of light faded, and the forest grew dark, almost oppressive. My flashlight was my only guide, its narrow beam cutting through the darkness. I tried to keep calm. I checked my compass and map, trying to figure out the direction of the ridge. I knew that if I could just make it there, I could see the surrounding area and find my way back. But the terrain was uneven, steep in places, covered with loose rocks. Each step was slow, careful. Hours passed. My water was running low. My legs were sore. My hands were scraped from brushing against branches. Every sound made me jump. A snapping twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an animal. I realized I had underestimated how quickly the forest could feel like a trap. I tried to focus on logic. I had to find higher ground. I had to get my bearings. I forced myself to keep moving, slowly climbing over fallen trees, sliding down muddy slopes, pushing through thick brush. Then came the real fear. I misstepped on a loose rock and tumbled down a short slope, hitting my side and twisting my ankle badly. Pain shot through me, sharp and relentless. I groaned, lying on the forest floor, trying to catch my breath. I realized I couldn't walk properly without risking further injury. Panic started to creep in, cold and heavy. I was alone, injured, in a forest I didn't fully know, and night had completely fallen. I sat there, clutching my ankle, trying to calm myself. I knew the first rule: don't panic. I rummaged through my backpack and found a bandage, wrapping my ankle as best I could. Every sound, the wind through the trees, the distant rustle of animals, made my heart pound. I realized that if I didn't act carefully, I could be trapped here for hours, maybe until morning. I tried to think through my options. Going back down was dangerous. The slope was steep, and I could slip again. Going forward was risky. I didn't know where the trail led. I decided to try forward, moving slowly, using my hands to stabilize myself on rocks and roots. Each step was calculated. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, revealing twisted tree trunks and the occasional patch of moss-covered rock. I felt like the forest was closing in on me. I stumbled again, though not as badly, and cursed under my breath. My energy was running low. I stopped to drink some water, eating another granola bar. Hours dragged on. The forest never seemed to end. Every slope, every patch of rocks, every dense thicket was another obstacle. My flashlight batteries were starting to dim, leaving me with a faint beam that barely illuminated the ground in front of me. I had to ration my remaining power. I realized I couldn't keep this pace all night. I needed a plan. I looked around and saw a relatively flat patch of ground, surrounded by thick trees. Not ideal, but it was sheltered. I decided to make camp for the night. I found some dry leaves and branches to create a small barrier from the cold ground, curling into my jacket to preserve warmth. I ate what little food I had left and drank a small amount of water. I knew sleep was risky, but I needed rest to recover. My ankle throbbed with pain, every movement reminding me of how fragile I had become in the forest. I tried to keep my mind focused on logic, wait for daylight, reassess, and slowly make my way to higher ground or a known landmark. The night was long and cold. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. I lay awake, tense, listening to branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant animal calls. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying not to let fear take over. I reminded myself that the forest was dangerous, yes, but I was prepared. I had survived other difficult trails. I could survive this. Finally, dawn came, pale light filtering through the trees. My body was stiff, my ankle swollen, but my spirit had survived the night. I carefully began to move again, testing each step, using branches and rocks for support. The light allowed me to see the trail, faint but there, winding uphill through the forest. Slowly, painstakingly, I made my way forward. I had to stop several times, resting, drinking water, eating small amounts of food, but gradually I gained higher ground. By late morning, I emerged onto the ridge I had been aiming for. From there, I could see the surrounding forest, the mountains stretching into the distance. I located a dirt road far below and traced it with my eyes, noting landmarks I could follow. Using the map and compass, I slowly made my way toward the road, moving carefully down slopes and through thick undergrowth. My ankle ached, but each step was a small victory. After several more hours, I finally reached the road. I was exhausted, bruised, and sore, but the sense of relief was overwhelming. I followed the road until I found a small town. People stared at me, dirty, scratched, tired, and carrying a heavy pack, but I didn't care. I had made it. I found water, food, and a place to rest, finally able to breathe freely. The experience left me shaken. I had underestimated the forest. It started as a simple plan. I had been feeling restless for weeks, trapped in the monotony of my life in the city. I needed space, I needed silence, I needed something that would make me feel alive again. So I packed my backpack with the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, a few days' worth of food, a water filter, some basic first aid supplies, and a map of the region. I told myself I would take a solo hike through the mountainous trails I had read about in a hiking blog. Nothing fancy, nothing extreme, just a few days away from people, phones, and everything that reminded me of routine. I wanted to get lost, but in a controlled way. I wanted to challenge myself, to see if I could survive a few days relying solely on my own planning, intuition, and energy. The morning I left, the sun was just rising, brushing the peaks in a soft orange glow that made the valleys below appear as pools of shadow. The air was crisp, scented with pine and wet earth from an overnight mist that had settled in the hollows of the mountains. I parked my car at a small lot near the trailhead, where a weathered wooden sign welcomed hikers and warned of potential hazards. Sudden weather changes, wildlife, uneven terrain. I made a mental note of the ranger's contact number posted on the sign. I didn't think I'd need it, but I like to be careful. After all, I had been hiking before, but never for more than a day, and never completely alone in a place this remote. I adjusted my backpack, tightened the straps, and stepped onto the trail, feeling the soft crunch of dirt and pine needles under my boots. The first hours were nothing out of the ordinary. The trail wound upward, alternating between open ridges where the sun felt hot against my skin and shaded pockets beneath old trees where it was cool enough for goosebumps. Birds flitted overhead, and now and then I spotted a squirrel or a chipmunk darting among the underbrush. I stopped occasionally to sip water or photograph the view, the sense of solitude settling in comfortably. I didn't feel lonely. I felt clear, as if the air itself had scrubbed away all the noise in my head. By midday, the trail became steeper, and my pace slowed. My legs burned from the incline, and sweat soaked my shirt. The wind picked up, brushing against my face and rustling through the branches. I reached a small ridge where the valley below stretched out in a dizzying panorama. I paused, leaning on my trekking poles, and breathed deeply. This was why I had come. I had imagined this exact scene countless times. Being alone, high above the world, feeling both small and expansive at once. I didn't notice the clouds gathering over the peaks to the west, the sky slowly turning a dull gray. I pushed on, telling myself the weather would hold. The trail was less defined now, a narrow dirt path lined with loose rocks and patches of thick vegetation. The air smelled wetter here, mossy, with a faint metallic tang I didn't recognize at first. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the mountain soil. As I ascended, the temperature dropped. I pulled on a lightweight jacket, but the wind was sharper here, cutting through the layers like it wanted to drive me back down the trail. I pressed on, my boots slipping slightly on wet stones, and I felt the first prickle of unease. I wasn't sure why exactly, but the trail felt different. There was no bird song now, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind sounded muted, filtered somehow by the surrounding peaks. It was as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The first incident happened around mid-afternoon. I was stepping over a fallen log when I heard a crack behind me, sharp and sudden, like a branch snapping. My heart jumped. I froze, scanning the area. Nothing moved. The trees and undergrowth were still. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a squirrel. I took a deep breath, shook my head, and kept moving. But then it happened again, another sharp crack, this time closer. I paused, gripping my trekking poles tighter. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I had the nagging sensation of being watched. I looked around, my eyes straining through the shadows and mist, but the forest appeared empty. My stomach tightened. I knew rationally that I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, though I didn't know what. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach the next clearing before nightfall. Hours passed, and the trail became more treacherous. Loose rocks gave way under my weight, and I had to carefully pick my footing to avoid twisting an ankle. The forest thickened, the trees ancient and knotted, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, merging into one another. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was strong, that I could handle this, but the feeling of being followed refused to fade. Every rustle, every faint crack, made me flinch. I reminded myself that wild animals inhabited these mountains. Bears, mountain lions, maybe even packs of coyotes. None of them wanted me unless I provoked them, I reasoned. Still, the rational mind doesn't always quiet the gut. Around late afternoon, I stumbled onto a small, abandoned trail junction. The signpost had faded completely, and the paths were overgrown with tall grass and brush. I realized I had lost the main trail. Panic didn't hit me immediately. I simply stood there, trying to orient myself with the map. I noticed that the sun was lower now, almost at the horizon, casting long streaks of light through the trees. I knew that if I stayed lost much longer, night would descend, and navigating in darkness here could be dangerous. I tried to remember the route I had taken, but the dense forest all around made it nearly impossible to determine direction. I could hear nothing but my own breathing and the occasional creak of branches under unseen pressure. The isolation pressed down on me. The feeling of being watched intensified. I chose a path that seemed to slope downward, reasoning that it might lead to the creek I had crossed earlier, which could take me back to the main trail. First, it was fine. The incline was manageable, and the trees began to thin slightly. But soon, the ground became slippery, moss-covered stones making every step precarious. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree root just in time. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through me. I realized I had nothing to grab onto if I fell again. The realization that I was alone, far from help, and entirely dependent on my own judgment hit me hard. I tried to stay calm, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other, but fear had settled into the pit of my stomach, twisting it into tight knots. Night fell faster than I expected. The shadows deepened into near blackness, and the temperature dropped sharply. I pulled out my headlamp, the narrow beam illuminating the immediate ground ahead of me, leaving the rest of the forest as a featureless void. Every sound seemed amplified. The snap of twigs under my own feet, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant, unidentifiable calls of animals I couldn't see. I realized then that I hadn't eaten since mid-morning, and my water supply was running low. My hands shook slightly as I checked my backpack for a snack. A granola bar and a small packet of trail mix. Enough for a few hours, but not for an extended night if I couldn't find the trail. I pressed on, moving slowly to avoid twisting an ankle or slipping down the steep slope. Hours passed like this, and I began to question my decisions. I had underestimated the trail. I had underestimated the mountains. I had assumed that experience from single-day hikes would translate to multi-day solo excursions. But the reality was harsher. My phone had no signal, the GPS barely worked under the thick canopy, and the map in my hands seemed almost useless now that every tree looked the same. I realized I might be stuck here until morning, which terrified me more than anything. Darkness in the forest is not quiet or safe. It is alive in ways the day hides. At one point, I thought I saw movement. Out of the corner of my eye, between two trees, something shifted. I froze, holding my breath. The shape moved again. Something large, moving silently. My heart jumped into my throat. It wasn't a human silhouette I could recognize, but it was big. A bear, maybe, or worse, a mountain lion. I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to take the chance of getting closer. I slowly backed up, keeping my headlamp aimed in the direction of the movement, trying to make myself look bigger and more visible. The figure didn't approach, but it didn't retreat either. Eventually, it disappeared into the blackness. My muscles ached, and the tension in my body felt like it would cramp me if I moved too quickly. I kept walking, even though every nerve screamed at me to stop and hide. By the time I reached what I thought was the creek from earlier, my legs were numb, my back ached from carrying the pack, and my hands were raw from gripping the poles. I followed the sound of running water carefully, using it as a guide. The creek was small but steady. I crouched beside it to drink, using my hands as a cup, but I didn't dare rest for long. Even the water seemed to echo, carrying sounds that weren't there, or maybe were. I realized that I had been walking for hours with only brief pauses. I had been planning this hike for months. It wasn't some casual weekend walk. It was the kind of hike that required serious preparation, and I wanted it to be the longest and most challenging route I had ever attempted. I had read every guidebook I could find, studied topographic maps, marked out water sources, and packed for every possible emergency. I was alone, as usual, because hiking with others always slowed me down and complicated things. There was a certain clarity in being alone with nothing but the forest, the rocks, the sun, and the wind. I wanted to test myself to see how far I could go without anyone else around. I wanted to experience the raw, unfiltered wilderness. I started early in the morning before sunrise, when the first light barely touched the peaks in the distance. The air was cold and damp, and the smell of wet earth and pine was strong. My pack felt heavy on my back, the straps digging into my shoulders, but I was used to the weight. I had all the essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, a small stove, extra clothes, a flashlight, and a compass. I had a small GPS device too, though I didn't rely on it completely. Part of the reason I loved hiking alone was the sense of relying on myself, on my skills, my senses, and my judgment. The trail started gradually, winding through a dense forest. The trees were tall and close together, and in the early light, their trunks looked black and solid, almost like towers. Birds stirred quietly, their calls distant and sharp. The ground was uneven, covered in layers of fallen needles and leaves, and occasionally the roots of trees pushed up in ways that made it easy to trip if I wasn't careful. I moved slowly at first, just walking, observing, letting my body wake up in rhythm with the terrain. I noticed the small details: the way the moss clung to the rocks, the subtle smell of damp leaves, the way the sun struggled to pierce through the thick canopy. As the morning progressed, the trail began to climb. At first it was gentle, a steady uphill walk that warmed my muscles and made my breathing heavier. Then the incline became sharper, forcing me to use my hands to pull myself up over rocks and fallen logs. My legs burned, and sweat started to run down my back under my pack. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. The birds disappeared, the wind seemed to fade, and even my own footsteps felt loud and intrusive. It was a strange, eerie quiet, the kind of quiet that made your own thoughts echo. I told myself it was normal, that it was just the way deep forests are, but there was a small knot of unease forming in my stomach. Not fear exactly, just that subtle, instinctive tension that comes when something is unfamiliar and isolated. By midday, I reached a ridge. The trees thinned, and I could see small valleys and streams far below. The view was incredible, but the wind was sharp, cutting through my jacket. I took a short break, drank some water, and ate a protein bar. As I rested, I noticed something strange. On the ridge ahead, there were tracks. Not animal tracks, at least not ones I recognized. They were deep, uneven, and spaced like a human stride. They were fresh. There was no rain or debris over them, and they cut across the path I was taking. My stomach tightened slightly. I had expected to see wildlife, maybe a deer or some birds, but human tracks out here were unusual. Most hikers stayed on established trails, and this path was not heavily used. I considered turning back, but something in me refused. I wanted to continue, partly out of stubbornness, partly out of curiosity. I followed the trail, trying to match the tracks carefully. They led me off the main path into a more rugged area, where the forest grew thicker and the ground more unstable. Loose rocks crunched underfoot, and the roots were more frequent, making every step deliberate. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and the occasional decaying log. The smell of rot was stronger here, mingling with the usual pine and earth. I noticed more signs of someone or something having been here recently. A broken branch at waist height, a small fire ring with old ashes, a discarded piece of cloth that looked like it had been left behind in a hurry. My heart rate picked up, but I told myself it was just another hiker who had passed through. The trail started to descend sharply. It was narrow, bordered by steep drops on one side and thick underbrush on the other. Every step required focus, and my legs were tired from the climb. I had to stop several times to catch my breath and stabilize myself. I kept thinking about the tracks. They were still there, leading me deeper into this isolated area. Something about the quiet made it feel almost unnatural. I realized I hadn't heard any birds or small animals for quite some time. It was too silent. Even the wind seemed hesitant to move through this part of the forest. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. The clearing was oddly shaped, almost like a circle, and there were more signs of recent human activity. Footprints, broken branches, and the faint scent of smoke. I paused, scanning the perimeter. The forest around me seemed to lean in, dense and dark, with no clear exit in some directions. Prickle ran down my spine. I realized that following these tracks had led me somewhere I hadn't planned to go. My GPS showed that I was off the main trail, several miles further than I intended. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me. I was alone, isolated, and the sun was going down. I needed to find my way back. I retraced my steps cautiously, trying to remain calm. The shadows grew longer, and the forest turned dark quickly. My flashlight cut a narrow cone of light, illuminating the path directly in front of me but leaving the rest of the forest as black shapes. Every sound seemed amplified. A branch snapping, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an unknown bird or animal. My breathing was steady, but the tension in my muscles made each step feel heavy. I tried to stay logical, telling myself that panic would make things worse. I needed to find the main trail, and I needed to do it before it got completely dark. Hours passed, or maybe it felt like hours, and the forest seemed endless. I stumbled over roots, slipped on loose rocks, and my hands scraped against bark as I tried to steady myself. At one point, I realized I had walked in a circle. The same fallen log appeared in front of me, the same moss-covered rock. I stopped, heart pounding, and tried to orient myself. My compass said one thing, my instincts said another. I remembered that I had left markers earlier in the day. Small piles of rocks I had stacked at certain points to mark the trail. I searched, but the markers were gone. Something had moved them, or perhaps I had overlooked them. Either way, I was truly lost. Night came fully. I was deep in the forest, no sign of any trail, no light except my weak flashlight. The cold was starting to seep into my bones, and I realized that I had misjudged the amount of water I had left. My energy was fading, my stomach a dull ache from hunger. I knew that continuing blindly would only make things worse. I had to make a decision. Stay put until morning or keep moving. The rational part of me knew that staying put in a safe, flat spot was smarter. I found a small clearing, relatively flat and free of rocks, and made a temporary shelter using my jacket and a few branches. I ate a small snack, drank a little water, and tried to rest. I kept my flashlight close, scanning the forest occasionally, though I saw nothing but shadows. Morning arrived slowly. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and the forest seemed almost alien in the pale light. I felt stiff and sore, but the clear thought of survival pushed me up. I needed to find water and a way back to the main trail. I remembered the streams I had seen on the map and decided to descend slowly, following what I hoped was a natural waterway. My movements were deliberate, careful not to slip. The forest floor was damp, muddy in some areas, and my boots sucked at the earth with each step. I drank cautiously from small pools, filtering water from leaves and stones when I could, careful not to risk sickness. After hours of moving slowly and deliberately, I finally heard the sound of running water. My heart lifted. Following the stream downstream, I navigated the slippery rocks and thick undergrowth, exhausted but focused. I realized that the tracks I had been following might have belonged to someone else who had wandered the same way, lost just like me. The thought was terrifying, but it also reminded me that this was a human wilderness problem, not some fantastical threat. Survival depended on patience, observation, and careful judgment. By late afternoon, I finally saw something familiar, a recognizable landmark, a sharp rock formation I had passed in the morning. Relief washed over me. I followed the trail signs carefully, matching them to my map, and eventually stumbled onto the main trail. My legs were trembling, my body was aching, and my water supply was dangerously low, but I was safe. I kept moving, keeping my pace slow to I had always thought of myself as an experienced hiker. Over the years, I had climbed trails that twisted through dense forests, hiked up steep rocky inclines, and followed narrow rivers through valleys that seemed to stretch endlessly. But nothing had prepared me for the hike I took that early September weekend. I had chosen a trail that was not well known, a trail that I had read about only briefly in a hiking forum. The description made it sound challenging but manageable, with a mix of moderate elevation, some wooded areas, and open sections that promised incredible views. I was eager to have a quiet weekend to myself, to escape the crowded trails I usually encountered. I started early on a Saturday morning, around 6 a.m., with the sun barely cresting the distant hills. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of pine and damp earth. My backpack was light but well-stocked. Water, some protein bars, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, and a map. My phone had a GPS app, but I intentionally didn't rely on it too heavily. I liked the challenge of navigating using my instincts and the landmarks I recognized from maps. The first few hours went smoothly. The trail was narrow, often flanked by dense underbrush and trees whose trunks were thick and gnarled with age. Birds sang intermittently, though I rarely saw them. The terrain alternated between soft earth, rocks, and patches of exposed roots that forced me to carefully watch my step. The higher I climbed, the more I noticed subtle changes in the air. The wind was slightly colder, carrying the dry scent of leaves and pine needles that had begun to fall. Every so often, I paused to drink water, check the map, and take photos of the view, which was breathtaking. Rolling hills stretched endlessly in shades of green and brown, with rivers glinting like silver threads far below. Around mid-morning, the trail narrowed considerably. The path had not been well maintained, and in some places it was almost overgrown. I had to push branches aside and step carefully over rocks and tangled roots. I noticed small signs of wildlife, scratches on tree trunks, small droppings, and even a few tufts of fur caught in the branches. It was reassuring and unsettling at the same time. I felt connected to the wilderness, yet painfully aware that it was also inhabited by creatures I could not see. By late morning, I reached a section where the forest opened into a small plateau. I could see for miles, and the sunlight was warm against my skin. I took a longer break here, sat on a flat rock, and ate a protein bar. I felt a sense of peace, surrounded by nature, with no other human presence for miles. It was a rare feeling, one that hikers like me often chased. But as I finished my snack, I noticed something odd in the distance. A faint trail diverging from the main path, partially hidden by tall grasses and shrubs. It wasn't marked on my map, and it seemed unused. Curiosity stirred in me, and I hesitated. On a normal hike, I would have ignored it, but there was something about this smaller path that drew me in, as if it held a secret worth discovering. I decided to follow it. The terrain changed almost immediately. The path was steeper, the rocks looser, and the underbrush thicker. I moved slowly, testing each foothold, gripping branches for balance. The forest grew denser, the canopy overhead blocking most of the sunlight. Shadows stretched unnaturally long between the trees, and the air felt heavier, almost damp. I kept going, telling myself that I would turn back if it seemed too dangerous. But something inside me pushed forward, the kind of stubbornness only an experienced hiker knows. I wanted to see what lay at the end of this hidden path. Hours passed. The trail twisted unpredictably. I stumbled a few times over hidden roots and sharp rocks, scraping my palms and knees. My backpack pressed heavily against my shoulders, and my legs burned with fatigue. I drank water at intervals, careful not to overdo it, knowing that I had to conserve energy. The forest was silent in ways that were both calming and unnerving. The usual sounds of birds or insects were minimal, replaced by the occasional rustle of leaves, which could have been wind or something else. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing. At first glance, it seemed like a natural resting spot, but as I stepped closer, I noticed something unusual. There were fresh footprints in the soft earth, too large and deep to belong to a small animal. I froze, trying to determine if they belonged to a human. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward a section where the trees grew even closer together. My stomach tightened. The trail had clearly been used, but not by casual hikers. I debated whether to follow them or retreat. The rational part of me said to turn back immediately, but another part wanted to know who or what had been here. I snapped a few photos of the tracks for reference and decided to continue cautiously. The forest thickened, and the path became more treacherous. Fallen trees blocked parts of the trail, and in some areas I had to climb over rocks slick with moss. My energy levels dropped as the afternoon wore on. The sun was beginning to angle toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. I realized I might not make it back to the main trail before dark. Panic began to creep in, though I forced myself to stay calm. I checked my phone. The GPS signal was weak, only a few scattered dots on the screen. The map showed I was somewhere between two small streams, but the details were vague. As I continued, I noticed more signs of recent activity. Torn bits of clothing caught in branches, more footprints, and even a makeshift fire pit that had been extinguished not long ago. My heart raced. Whoever had been here was nearby, or at least had been very recently. I slowed my pace, listening intently for sounds, straining to catch the faintest movement. The forest seemed to grow more oppressive, as if it was closing in on me. Every step felt heavier. Every shadow seemed to shift slightly in my peripheral vision. I pressed on, determined not to panic. The trail eventually led to a small ridge, overlooking a narrow valley. The view was stunning, but I barely noticed it. What caught my attention was the faint sound of rushing water far below. I remembered the map indicating a stream that ran through this area, and I reasoned that following the water might lead me back to the main trail. Carefully, I began my descent using rocks and roots for stability. The incline was steep, and the ground was loose, requiring all my focus. A misstep here could have serious consequences. My legs burned, my hands scraped against rocks and branches, and my heart pounded with effort and fear. After an hour of careful climbing, I reached the stream. The water was cold and clear, and I knelt to drink, grateful for the brief respite. Following the stream seemed like the safest option. It would eventually lead to a larger river or a trailhead. As I moved along the bank, the forest grew denser again, and I noticed more tracks. This time they were paired, suggesting two people had passed this way recently. My anxiety spiked, but I focused on staying silent and moving deliberately. The last thing I wanted was to be noticed if whoever had left the tracks was still nearby. Hours passed as I followed the stream. Darkness began to fall, and the temperature dropped rapidly. I realized I needed to find a safer spot for the night. The forest offered few options: dense underbrush, steep slopes, or rocky outcrops. I found a small flat area partially sheltered by fallen trees. It wasn't comfortable, but it would protect me from wind and potential rain. I set down my backpack, pulled out my flashlight, and checked my supplies. I had enough water and a few remaining protein bars, but I knew I couldn't rest too long. I needed to reach safety the next morning. I tried to sleep, but the sounds of the forest kept me alert. Twigs snapping in the distance, the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash of water. I convinced myself it was wildlife, though I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I wrapped myself in my jacket, trying to stay warm, and dozed fitfully. At dawn, I set out again, following the stream. The daylight revealed more details. The forest floor was uneven, The water flowed quickly in some sections, and there were small cliffs and boulders I had to navigate carefully. My legs were stiff from sleeping on the hard ground, but I moved steadily. Around mid-morning, I finally saw signs of human structures in the distance. An old bridge and a dirt road partially overgrown with grass. Relief washed over me. I had made it through the densest part of the forest, and help was within reach. I reached the road and followed it for a while, eventually encountering a small park ranger station. I explained my route and what had happened. The ranger listened carefully and took my report about the footprints and the fire pit. It turned out that the area I had explored was occasionally used by hunters and sometimes hikers, but because it was remote and overgrown, many people were unaware of it. The tracks I had followed were likely from hunters who had passed through recently. Though I had never encountered them directly, the thought of them being nearby in the dark was unnerving. After a brief rest at I had been planning this hike for months. The trail was supposed to be challenging but not impossible. A 3-day trek through a dense mountain region I had never explored before. I packed my backpack meticulously, making sure to include extra food, water, a first aid kit, and a sturdy flashlight with spare batteries. I was confident in my experience and preparation, but I had no idea that what I thought would be a simple hiking adventure would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I started my hike early in the morning. The sun was just rising, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and pink. The air was cool, crisp, and slightly damp from overnight dew. The trailhead was quiet, with only the occasional bird song breaking the silence. I walked steadily, the rhythm of my boots against the dirt path comforting. The first day passed without incident. I marveled at the tall pines that lined the trail, their needles creating a soft carpet beneath my feet. Small streams crossed my path, and I paused to fill my water bottle from the clearest, coldest water I had ever tasted. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing where I decided to take a break and eat. I sat on a large rock, opened my backpack, and ate a simple sandwich. Around me, the forest seemed alive. Squirrels darted up trees, birds flew overhead, and the wind rustled the leaves in a way that made the world feel alive, but also slightly menacing. There was something about the isolation that made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper, but I brushed it off as natural wilderness. After lunch, I continued on the trail, feeling invigorated. The path started to ascend more steeply, and the trees grew denser, blocking much of the sunlight. The air became colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. By late afternoon, I reached the top of a ridge. From there, the view was breathtaking. Rolling mountains stretching as far as I could see, their peaks partially shrouded in mist. I took several photos, carefully choosing spots to capture the light filtering through the trees. As I descended from the ridge, I noticed that the trail became less defined. The markers I had relied on earlier seemed more sporadic, and the path was littered with fallen branches and loose rocks. I felt a twinge of unease, but told myself I could handle it. I had been hiking in remote areas before, and I was sure I could manage. I continued, concentrating on placing each step carefully to avoid slipping. By late afternoon, the weather began to change. Clouds rolled in, and the sunlight dimmed. A light drizzle started, which quickly turned into a steady rain. The trail became slippery, and my boots struggled for grip on the wet rocks and mud. I slowed down, aware that descending too quickly in these conditions could be dangerous. The rain was relentless, soaking through my jacket despite its waterproof lining. My fingers and toes began to feel numb, and I realized I needed to find shelter soon. I spotted a small rocky outcrop a short distance from the trail. It wasn't much, but it would provide some protection from the rain. I hurried toward it, setting down my backpack and using it to shield myself as I tried to dry off as much as possible. I ate some trail mix to keep my energy up, checking the map on my phone. Battery levels were low, and the signal was weak. I calculated that if I kept moving at a slow pace, I could reach a small campsite marked on the map before dark. I decided to take the risk, knowing staying out in the open in worsening weather was more dangerous. The descent became more treacherous as the rain continued. The soil turned to mud, and rocks became slick. I slipped a few times, barely catching myself with my hands, and each time my heart raced with fear. I realized that I had underestimated the difficulty of the trail in wet conditions. The more I focused on my footing, the more I noticed unusual sounds around me. The rain masked most noises, but occasionally, I heard the distinct snapping of a branch behind me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound repeated, almost rhythmically, and always behind me. I quickened my pace, my eyes scanning the dense trees around me, but I saw nothing. My imagination started running wild. Every shadow became a threat, every rustle a warning. By the time the sun had fully set, I was exhausted. The trail markers had become almost non-existent, and I realized I was probably off the main trail. My phone's light was weak, and I had used most of my backup batteries. The rain showed no sign of stopping, and I was shivering, soaked to the bone. I needed to find a safe place to wait out the night. I remembered seeing a narrow ravine a few hundred meters back while descending. It was covered by large boulders and overhanging trees. I backtracked carefully, slipping on the wet ground, and eventually reached it. The space was tight, but it offered some shelter from the rain. I crawled in, huddled under my soaked jacket, and tried to calm myself. The sound of water rushing through the nearby stream was loud and constant, almost drowning out every other noise. My body ached, and I realized my energy was dangerously low. I ate a protein bar, hoping it would sustain me. As darkness enveloped the forest, I became acutely aware of my vulnerability. The ravine provided shelter, but it also trapped me. If a rock shifted or if the stream overflowed, I would be in serious trouble. I spent hours sitting there, shivering, trying to stay awake and alert. Every sound made my heart race. The rustle of leaves, the patter of rain on the rocks, the occasional distant howl of an animal. I tried to reason with myself, reminding myself that most of these animals were not dangerous if I stayed still and quiet. Still, fear gnawed at me. Morning came slowly. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, and the forest was covered in a thick mist. I cautiously emerged from the ravine, assessing my surroundings. The trail was still hard to see, but I noticed a faint set of tire tracks to one side. It was a logging road I hadn't noticed on the map. Relief washed over me. I wasn't lost, at least not completely. I followed the road carefully, mindful of the slippery mud and hidden roots. Hours passed as I slowly made my way down the road. My body was stiff, my feet sore, and my energy was low. I drank water sparingly, rationing what I had left. The road eventually led to a small creek, and following the water downstream, I stumbled upon a narrow wooden bridge. Crossing it, I realized I had finally found a path that would lead back to civilization. I felt a surge of hope, mixed with exhaustion and relief. The rest of the day was a long trek through dense underbrush, but the path was more forgiving. I encountered fallen trees and muddy patches, but I moved steadily, keeping my focus on reaching a recognizable point on the map. Around late afternoon, I heard the faint sound of an engine. My heart leapt. I had reached a Forest Service road. Following the sound, I finally saw a small maintenance vehicle parked near a ranger station. I approached cautiously, waving my hands to get attention. The ranger looked surprised to see me, drenched and dirty, but quickly came to assist. I explained where I had started and what had happened. They provided a dry jacket, food, and water. After reporting my exact location and the trail I had taken, arrangements were made to get me back safely. Sitting in the ranger station, warming up, I reflected on the experience. The fear and exhaustion had been overwhelming, but I realized that my preparation and persistence had saved me. I had stayed calm, rationed my resources, and made careful decisions, even when panic threatened to take over. I knew I had been lucky. One wrong step on the slippery descent or a miscalculation in finding shelter could have been fatal. By evening, I was back at my car, driving away from the mountains with a mixture of relief and lingering tension. I promised myself I would respect the power of nature more and never underestimate even a familiar-looking trail. The experience left me shaken, but also more aware of my limits and the importance of preparation. I knew I would hike again, but I also knew that I would never take the wilderness for granted again. The mountains had tested me, and I had survived, but I carried with me a permanent reminder of how fragile human endurance can be when confronted with raw, unforgiving nature. The memory of that night stayed with me long after the trip ended. The constant fear, the relentless rain, the isolation, and the near helplessness. It was a lesson in vigilance, patience, and humility. Most importantly, it was a reminder that even experienced hikers are not immune to the dangers of the wilderness, and that survival often depends on careful thought, slow, deliberate action, and an unshakable will to keep moving forward, no matter how bleak the situation may appear. I had been planning the hike for months, meticulously picking a trail that was supposed to be challenging but not impossible, remote but not dangerous. The trailhead was several hours from the nearest town, deep in a mountain range I barely knew except for maps and old hiking blogs. I packed carefully: water, extra food, a first aid kit, a flashlight with spare batteries, a small camping stove, and a heavy-duty survival blanket. I left my car at the trailhead parking lot, double-checking that I had locked it, and set off just as the sun was starting to burn away the morning mist. The forest was dense and wet, the air still cold even though it was late spring. The beginning of the hike was almost relaxing. The path wound upward through tall pine and spruce trees, and the sun shone through the branches in golden strips. I could hear birds and the occasional rustle of squirrels or deer. I hiked at a steady pace, stopping only briefly to drink water and check the map. The trail was well marked at first, and I felt confident. There were occasional blazes on the trees and small cairns marking turns. The air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. After a few hours, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, both paths would eventually meet again, but one was marked as the Ridge Trail, and the other as the Valley Route. The Ridge Trail seemed steeper and narrower with potential views, while the Valley Route looked flatter and longer. I decided to take the Ridge Trail. I liked a challenge, and I thought the scenery would make the extra effort worth it. The Ridge Trail immediately tested me. The path narrowed to barely a foot in some places with steep drops on one side. Rocks and tree roots protruded in random patterns, forcing me to watch my footing constantly. I moved slowly, gripping roots and rocks for balance, careful not to slip. The higher I went, the more isolated the trail felt. The forest thinned in places, revealing sheer cliffs and far below, winding rivers I had glimpsed from a distance. The wind picked up as I climbed, and I felt the temperature drop. Sweat ran down my face, but a chill from the wind made it sting as it dried. I stopped briefly at a rock outcrop and took out my camera, snapping pictures of the view. That's when I noticed something odd. From my vantage point, I could see a section of the Ridge Trail below me, and there was a faint impression of footprints in the mud. They were fresh, too fresh, maybe a few hours old. That gave me a pause. I had seen no other hikers in hours. The trail was supposed to be remote enough that hikers were sparse, and cell reception was almost non-existent. I told myself it was probably just another early hiker who had gone ahead of me. I didn't think much of it and continued upward. By midday, clouds began to roll in, gray and thick. I checked my watch and realized I had been hiking for almost 6 hours without a proper break. My legs were sore, my water supply was halfway gone, and the ridge seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. I knew I needed to find a safe spot to rest and eat. I found a small flat area surrounded by rocks, just wide enough to sit, and took out my food. I drank slowly, savoring the warmth from my small stove and the convenience of instant meals. While eating, I listened to the wind whistling through the trees and tried to shake off a creeping unease that had begun to settle in my chest. After resting, I continued. The clouds thickened, and soon fog began to roll along the ridge, reducing visibility to only a few meters in front of me. The narrow trail now felt precarious. Every step required focus, and the fog made it hard to see where the trail ended and the cliff began. The rocks underfoot were slippery from recent rain, and I began to feel a sense of isolation that gnawed at me. Each small sound, the scrape of a branch, the distant call of a bird, sounded louder in the fog. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a point where the trail split again. I consulted my map, but the fog made it nearly impossible to identify landmarks. I chose the left fork, hoping it would keep me closer to the summit. Immediately, the trail became less defined. There were no blazes or cairns, only faint depressions in the dirt where hikers might have passed before. The incline increased sharply, and loose stones made my footing uncertain. The higher I climbed, the more I felt the remoteness pressing in, the kind of remoteness that makes you hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. Hours passed, and I began to realize something worrying. I hadn't seen any signs of other hikers for a long time, not even faint footprints in the mud, which now seemed drier and harder. My stomach sank as the reality hit me. I had lost the main trail somewhere along the way. The ridge split in multiple directions, some of them leading dangerously close to the cliff edges. I tried to retrace my steps, but the fog and uneven terrain made it nearly impossible. My heart pounded as I considered my options. I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The sun would set soon, and temperatures at this altitude would drop sharply. I also knew that staying put without a signal for help was risky. The area was too remote for anyone to stumble upon me accidentally. I decided to pick a direction that seemed safest, following what little imprint of a trail I could see. My pace was slow, deliberate, and careful, checking every step and testing the stability of rocks before putting my full weight down. As the afternoon drifted into evening, the fog became heavier. Soon, I could see barely a meter in front of me. I could hear the faint rush of water from the river below, but it was distorted in the fog and seemed farther away than it probably was. The wind picked up again, sharp and cold, slicing through my jacket and chilling my bones. My backpack felt heavier, my legs weaker. I realized I had miscalculated how much daylight I had left. Panic flickered briefly at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. Panic would make me careless, and a single slip here could be fatal. By late evening, darkness had fallen. My flashlight barely penetrated the thick fog, casting long, uncertain shadows that made the rocky outcrops seem taller, more menacing than they actually were. I stumbled over a hidden root and cursed quietly, checking my legs for injuries. Fortunately, only scrapes and bruises, but every step now required intense focus, and I could feel exhaustion clawing at me. My food was almost gone, and my water supply had dwindled dangerously low. Then I heard a sound that made my heart skip, a low, echoing crack of a rock shifting somewhere near the cliff edge. My body froze. I realized just how exposed I was. One misstep and I could tumble hundreds of meters down a sheer drop. My breathing became shallow as I scanned the area with my flashlight. The sound repeated, a few seconds later, closer this time. I realized it was not an animal. Animals didn't make rocks crack like that, and the sound seemed unnervingly deliberate in its timing. My mind raced. Perhaps the ground was unstable. Perhaps a small landslide was imminent. I had no way of knowing, and moving without caution could be deadly. I made a slow, careful retreat to a small section of flat rock that jutted slightly inward from the cliff. I set down my pack, checked my supplies, and wrapped myself in the survival blanket. I realized I would have to spend the night here. There was no other choice. I tried to calm myself, counting deep breaths, keeping my muscles loose but ready to react if necessary. I wrapped my arms around my knees, trying to conserve body heat. Hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into an eternity. I could hear rocks shifting in the distance, the wind howling around the ridge, and the distant, distorted call of wildlife. Sleep was impossible. Morning came finally, pale light filtering through the fog. My body ached from the cold and the tension of staying perched on the ledge all night. I drank the last of my water and ate what little food remained, planning my next moves carefully. The fog had lifted somewhat, giving me just enough visibility to assess my surroundings. From my vantage point, I could see that the ridge I had been following ended abruptly, dropping into a narrow valley below. The cliffside was steep, but not entirely vertical in all places. I realized I might be able to descend carefully if I moved slowly and strategically. I spent hours descending, testing rocks, and finding stable handholds. Every step required focus and patience. I scraped my hands and legs against rocks and roots, my muscles screaming in protest, but gradually I made progress. Around midday, I reached a gentler slope, where small shrubs and trees provided better footing. My sense of relief was immense, but I stayed cautious. One careless move could still mean serious injury. By mid-afternoon, I reached the river I had seen from above. It was shallow in places, and I was able to cross carefully using stones and fallen logs. My feet were wet, my legs tired, but I could see a faint dirt trail running along the riverbank. It was not the main trail from my map, but it was a trail nonetheless, and it appeared to lead downward toward civilization. My spirits lifted, and I moved as quickly as my